Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to today's episode of Madison's Notes. We are the official podcast of Princeton University's James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions, and I am your host, Laura Laurent. Today, I am thrilled to invite you into this conversation with Dennis Unkovic. He is a senior partner with the law firm Meyer, Unkovic & Scott in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He is also the author of The Fragility of China, Breaking Points of an Invincible Regime, which was published in July of this year. Now, Dennis has had a prolific and international legal career and frequently briefs business executives, trade associations, and government leaders on high-profile issues, and he has traveled to over 65 countries during his career with significant involvement in China. So today, we discuss, yes, his book, The Fragility of China, and also how nearly 4 decades of economic growth has convinced many of us in the West that China is some sort of invincible regime. However, based on his extensive experience and research in East Asia, Dennis reveals to us that China is not invulnerable, but in fact is far more fragile than is outwardly conveyed. So, join us today to uncover the complex system underlying internal Chinese politics and society, and what exactly threatens the perception of an invincible regime going forward. Hello and welcome, Dennis Unkovic, to Madison's Notes. We're really looking forward to this conversation about your recent publication, The Fragility of China. I've read your book. It was quite engaging. It's a particular subject that I have interest in, and so we're just very excited to have you on the show today.
Laura, thanks for having me, and I look forward to having an interesting discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and so just to get started on the basis of some of the way your book is structured, you have a term, max trends, which has been trademarked. Can you give us a little bit more detail onto how this concept of max trends is a cementing basis for some of the concepts that you are presenting to us about the relationship of Chinese politics moving forward?
Sure. In life, all of us think we're in total control, that everything that we think should happen happens. Well, as you and I know, that's never the case. Max trends is a term which I've trademarked, but the purpose was to identify developments or events that can affect a country, an individual, and a company that are outside of our control. And so, as we will speak about, I assume, over the next few minutes, what these max trends are, but they are things that are going to affect, in this particular case, China. And Xi Jinping, as you know, is the current leader of China for the last 12 or 13 years. There are things that Xi Jinping can't control. There are things that China itself can't control, and they're very important. So as we look at China, that's what I hope we can discuss today.
Well, and this leads me to my next question about the purpose of your book. Why did you feel it was important to have this discussion now? Why write this book now? And what do you think it is that people often maybe misinterpret or get wrong when having discussions about Chinese political action?
A lot of Americans don't know a lot about Asia. I first went to China in, I think, 1985, and I've been back there, I'm guessing probably 50 times or more since then, doing business. As a result, I think I understand China and I think I understand Asia. Now, if you go back to the 1960s, when Mao, who was then the head of the Chinese Communist Party in China, one of the poorest countries in the world was China. They actually had starvation, and during the Great Leap Forward and other things that happened back then, they had very serious problems. Over the last 35 or 40 years, China has grown from being one of the poorest nations in the world to now being the second largest economy in the world, second, of course, to the United States. As we look forward to the rest of this century, some people have written books saying this will be the century of China. I think that's not necessarily going to happen, because I think there's some very significant challenges facing the Chinese leadership and the Chinese people that are not necessarily recognized. That's why, thank you for saying it a few minutes ago, I made up this word max trends. And so let's talk about these really key things, because we now have very serious problems around the world. We have the war in the Ukraine, we have the problems in the Middle East, which we all know well about. But if you're looking over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years, America is going to have one major economy and perhaps military opponent who is going to challenge it, and that's the People's Republic of China. And so I think the more your listeners know about China, its goals, its ambitions, and maybe what it can and can't do, it would be helpful. So about 2 years ago, I started writing this book, and this is my 12th book. But writing a book is always difficult, but this is the one I've enjoyed the most, because when you're looking down the line over the next 20 or 30 years, where are we as a country, we're talking now in the United States, going to be versus China?
So, getting into some of these max trends that you express, looking forward as far as where we're going to be by the end of this century or even 30 years from now, let's start with demographics, which is one of the max trends that you signify in your book. Is China's demographic problem really any different from our own in terms of an inverted pyramid and a lack of ability to meet a replacement rate? Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Sure. Let's start this way. Every society has to have about 2.1 children for women of a certain age in order for the population to remain stable. Those populations where you have 3 or 4 children being born, then the populations will go up. What we've seen over the last 2 years, I'm now talking about 2022, 2023, China's population, which is now about 1.3 billion people, maybe 1.4. Nobody really knows, but that's the range of where it is. They have a lot of people, and everybody says, "Look at all the Chinese. They have so many people. They're going to have a lot of problems." What happened in 2022, and again last year in 2023, is that their population growth rate went below the 2.1. In fact, it went down significantly enough that this is the first drop in Chinese population that I think I've ever seen. And you're going to say, well, so what? What if they lost a few thousand or 100,000 or million people? There's been a study done that said in 2021, and we're now in, 2024, 75 years from now, the Chinese population that is 1.3 or 1.4 billion people will be about half. It'll be about 770 million people. That has great implications for China, for its industry, for its resources, and so that is really a very significant issue. And clearly, the Chinese have not been able to deal with this very well. Maybe you're interested in how this came about.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
There was a guy named Thomas Malthus who, in the 19th century, he was a economist, philosopher. He scared the world to death because he said at that time, "I predict that the world will essentially come to an end because we'll have more and more people. All right, we will be able to produce less and less food, and at the end result, there'll be great starvation, and the world will be in a big problem." And so what happened in China is in the 1960s, they went through a very serious economic problem. There was great poverty. And so the government said, well, I don't know if they said, well, if Malthus said this, but a lot of governments said, let's see if we can control population. So the Chinese did. This was not Xi Jinping. This is 35 years ago. They had put in what's called the one child policy. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, a woman in her childbearing years was not just suggested, but she was told, you will not have more than one child.
Mm-hmm.
And this happened at the same time. Other demographic stuff that we'll be talking about in the next few minutes happened. But what's result is that China's population is now beginning to decline in a significant way. As I said a couple of minutes ago, it's going to go from 1.4 billion to about half in the next 70 years. And that has great implications for China. That's sort of like one demographic problem. There's a related demographic problem, if I can say it, that has to do with um, elderly people. All right. I don't know what elderly is, but in China, you're expected to retire at age 55. If you're a woman working in a blue collar job, a manual labor job, you're expected or you're encouraged up till now to retire at 50. Well, what's happening in China is the Chinese people are living longer, so they're getting older, but China does not have a social network or, basket to help them when they get older. In the United States, as you know, as we all know, people are on Social Security, they have 401ks, they have savings, and so over their lifetime of work, they're able to hopefully accumulate enough money through Social Security to take them through the retirement years. China doesn't have anything like this. So if you go back to the traditional Chinese society, there would be a family, there would be children, and until really about 50 or 60 years ago, most people were living in a rural setting. So back then, the 60s we talked about before, the Chinese women were oftentimes having 4 and 5 and 6 children. Now, obviously, there were death rates with children. There were lots of problems, but this growth has contracted so much so that China actually began to be a little bit aware of this because they've seen this declining birth rate. But as I said 2 or 3 years ago, it went negative. And because of this, the Chinese leadership says to themselves, or they should be saying, I know they are, do I have enough workers? You know, who's going to take care of these elderly people? In the old days, if mother and father worked and they had the children, when they reached the age of 55 or 60, depending on what it was, they would retire. And what would they do? They would move in with the children, and the children would take care of them. Well, in China today, where the average birth rate is going down, women are not at home as much. Some are working, and there's really no place for the older people to go. So, what's the problem? You have too few children coming on to essentially become workers and to drive the economy, and you have older people who are over 60 um, getting older and yet not having enough income. These are tremendous demographic, as you said a minute ago, pressures that are being placed upon the Chinese economy. And it's something that the leadership is looking at, but it's very difficult for them, Laura, to say, what am I going to do with this? How do I solve this kind of problem?
Do you think that their attempts at addressing this issue is significant enough? Are they going to have to excuse me? Are they going to have to start relying on alternative measures? What is their response to try to curtail this issue?
Well, about 5 or 6 years ago, Xi Jinping said, I'm going to relax the one child policy. So now the one child policy became a two-child policy. A couple of years went by, and guess what happened? Nothing. I mean, nothing happened, but there was not more childbearing going on. So about a year, 2 or 3 years ago, they said, "Oh well, don't worry about that. You can have more children." And at first, when the one-child policy was there, couples could be lose their jobs. They could
Mhm.
have pressures put on them by the state saying you have too many children, you're not going to get support. Well, now the Chinese have turned it around. What you referred to a minute ago was there was a major women's conference in China, and Xi Jinping was, as the leader of China, there to say to everybody, look, I want family values to become more important. And he looked at these women and said, you have more children. Well, what's happened globally is this isn't just a China problem. If you look at
Yes.
Japan, you look at Korea, they have the same kinds of not enough children being born. I think probably the country with the most significant problem is Korea. I've seen a statistic that's saying instead of the 2.1 to sort of keep your population, Korea's down around zero point 0.8. And so their population is not bad. It's going to get, or it's going to get much fewer children, more pressures on them. But China's China. I mean, Korea is probably the eighth or 10th largest economy in the world. But you're talking about, let's use numbers for a minute. All right. When you talk about trillions, T's, not B's, trillions of dollars, the GDP, gross domestic product of a country, is sort of like, how big is it? What do you produce a year? If you look at the United States, we're at about, I mean, I might be off by a trillion, I'm making a joke, but we're about 2.6, $26 trillion, okay? Number two is China. It's about 1.7 or 1.8 trillion. So we are ahead of the Chinese, but the Chinese have over the last couple of years been, narrowing the gap. Now, if you look at Chinese economics for a minute, if you want to have a country, you have to have enough workers, right? And you have to have enough of the economy to be driven by. That's been a problem for China because their growth rate as an economy between, let's say, the late 1980s until about 2012 or 13, for about 20 years, it was growing at between 6 to 12% per year. That's amazing, right? So the people in China today are richer than the people in China have ever been. But what has happened really since 2012 or 13? The Chinese growth, how much their economy grew per year, has been going down. This year, we're now at the end of 2024 when we're doing this interview. The Chinese have been saying, well, our growth rate this year will be, this year being 2024, 5%. Well, guess what? I don't think they're going to reach that. It'll be less than. And so if you have an economy where people have been used to their wealth, their personal wealth, the wealth of a country going up year after year after year, everything looks very great. But if you go from 12% growth to, let's say, I'm guessing this year will be 4.7 or 4.8% growth, that's significant because China, we can talk about it later, borrows a lot of money, that it doesn't have in order to underwrite a lot of things. It becomes more and more difficult for an economy to sustain itself. One other thing that I think is sort of interesting, when you say China grew, Dennis, what did you mean? Well, in the 1970s, when Nixon was around, long before you were born, okay, the Chinese economy could be measured in the billions of dollars, okay? High billions. Today, 35 years later, it's like 17 trillion. How did it grow that quickly? If you grow an economy at 8.5% per year, which the Chinese did for about
That's
20
astounding.
years, every 8 years you double it. So you double, you double, you double. That's how the second largest economy in the world used to be Japan. Before that, it was Germany, and it was China. But China leapfrogged above everybody else because their economy was able to grow so quickly. That's reversed. And so your question to me, Laura, a few minutes ago is this demographics important? It's vitally important because without enough people working to produce enough goods, your economy is going to grow more and more slowly. And you can see the ramifications of that.
I want to continue in on the max trends that are going to be affecting China internally. And that brings us to real estate and currency. Can you give a bit of a backdrop as to the real estate crisis that is currently happening in China? It's something that we've heard on the news here and there, but not all of us might be familiar with why exactly this is going to be such a impacting component to the future Chinese internal political system.
Okay, let's compare the U.S. economy to the Chinese economy. All right. What makes up the economy of the United States? And basically, between 14 and 16%, that's a rough estimate, is based upon real estate, homes, condos, office buildings, shopping centers. But that's like, 16, 14% of the economy. If our real estate problems in the United States manifest themselves, and we can all remember back to 2008 and 2010, what happened when we had the crisis. Pretty bad, right? Let's talk about China. China has about between 25 and 30% of its economy based upon real estate, or not quite twice what it is in the US, but pretty close. This is what happened. All of the land in China is owned by the government. It's essentially owned by the government. But in the 1990s, the government said, well, why don't we lease out some of this land? So at that time, laws were passed which basically said if you wanted to you wanted to buy a condo, for example, in a building, in that case, you'd say, okay, I get a 75-year lease on this box. Okay, you don't own it, but not many people are going to live more than 75 years after they buy a house. And then the suggestion was, we'll renew that lease. So basically, the Chinese said you can buy real estate. The Chinese people are very hardworking and very smart, and they said, hey, there's a place to put my money. And they did. So there were public developers, SOEs, state-owned enterprises that did construction, but there were a lot of private companies that went and built high-rises, condos, houses not so much because houses are really expensive and land is expensive. But so the average Chinese person once, remember we talked a few minutes, so what did they do with their extra money? Their stock markets are something we could talk about another time, but not very transparent and a little risky to put into. But they said, what's a better thing for me to do as a Chinese person, middle class, because I have a car, maybe, I have a refrigerator, I have stove, whatever else it is. Where am I going to put my money? You know the answer, Laura. They put it into real estate. All right. Today, I would estimate that of the savings that the average Chinese person has, these are people who've done better. I'm not talking about the people on the farms, but in the cities, they put them into real estate. So there were an enormous millions, I'm not exaggerating, millions and millions of units that were built over the last 10 or 15 years. But the economy really got hit there in China, and it's gone around the world. But there were private developers. The most significant one is called Evergrande. They were building literally millions of units, and they would take money from you, all right? And they'd say, okay, in 6 months from now, I'll build you a condo in Shenzhen. And then you'd put your money down and you'd invest it. A lot of these private companies over the last 3 or 4 years have gone bankrupt or are in receivership or are being reorganized. But a lot of the people who put their money into their condos and actually got a condo are seeing that their investments are going down, or the value of the condo or their apartment is going down. A lot of people put their life savings into it and gave it to companies like Evergrande. Another one is Country Garden, and there are a bunch of them. And those companies did not have enough money to build what was promised. And this is a construction story around the world. Most construction companies never have enough money to do what they're doing. So if they have $5 coming in the front door, they use it to pay for what somebody gave them yesterday, and it's like a daisy chain. And so as long as they're not making sausage, as long as there's enough sausage going in one end, it's going to come out the other end, right? But when this breaks down, and COVID was tragic for China, China's first drop in growth rate occurred in 2020, dropped for the first time since, I think, 1976. So, a country that had been growing 6 or 12%, everybody's doing well, everybody's making money, all of a sudden it stopped. And so there are literally, no exaggeration, millions of units in China that can't be sold. There's another thing. There are major cities in China that you've heard about. You've heard about Beijing, you've heard about Shanghai, you've probably heard about Harbin, but there are lots of other million cities with millions or more people in China. As China started to grow over the last 20 or 30 years, the second and third tier cities, in other words, being not the Shanghais and the Beijings, their local governments went out. And what did they do? They encouraged these private developers to come in and say, hey, why don't you build me a 60-story building with, 2,000 units, and everybody will move to this small town. When the pressure came on the economy, when you've had the collapse over the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of those local governments got stuck because maybe then they said, well, we'll build it, the old express, what's the movie?
If you build it, they will come.
Build it, well, they will come. Well, they built it and they didn't come. And there are literally, I don't know how many million Chinese people, but most of their investments in real estate, if they actually got something, are worth less now than they were in the past. The people who tried to put their life savings into this with a company that ends up going bankrupt, you don't have to be a genius to know, the money's gone. Now, the Chinese government has a problem. What does it do? Does it go and take all of its money and try to fix this problem? In my opinion, if the Chinese government tried to do this, it's not a billion-dollar problem. It's a trillion or multi-trillion-dollar problem. That Xi Jinping has not done. No, whether he should do it or not, I'm not a politician. He has to decide. But digging out this hole that exists now for the real estate market is really serious. And it has gotten worse and worse since COVID. Now, nobody, I don't think anywhere, can honestly say they saw COVID coming. But now that COVID came, it's a very serious problem. Now, we can talk at another time if you want about the global supply chain, but there could be another COVID tomorrow, God forbid. But if it did, the same kind of problems would have. And so China's economy, to go back to the beginning here, a third of it is in real estate. Real estate is in the dumps. And so if you're wondering why China's not growing at 6 or 7 or 8 or 10%, it's because that's the problem with real estate and it's not getting any better. Does that answer your
Hmm.
question?
It does. And I think there's that's yeah, no, it definitely answers my question. And it's something that I wanted to ask, tying into their currency issues. Something that I enjoyed learning from your book is about the Chinese, how did you pronounce it? Renminbi?
Renminbi, right? Yes.
Renminbi, excuse me, an extra N in
RMB.
there.
Let's call it say
Yeah,
RMB. Yeah, that's fine.
R&B. Yeah, and how it's a internally controlled currency, and how it's not you're not able to exchange it across international markets, etc. And this worked out well for China in, say, the global 2008 crash, because they were somewhat insulated from it. They didn't have their money tied up with the rest of the world, and so when the crash came, they were protected from that. How is that affecting their economy now, as they're seeing this drop in real estate? Is there a connection between their real estate economy and the way that the RMB is interacting with their internal economies?
Good question. Let me make it as basic as I can. In global trade, if you want to get paid, you want to get paid in some money that you can convert into something else. The dollar is and has been the premier currency around the world, no matter where you were. We have the euro, very significant. We have the Swiss franc, we have the Japanese yen, we have the Korean won. They all have one deal saying, if I give you $1, I'll give you 2.2 won, or I'll give you 100 yen. Doesn't really matter what it is, but these markets adjust every day. So if I sell something in Japan and they hand me 100 yen, I'll say, okay, I want to convert that into a dollar and I'm going to do that. That's how global trade works. Nobody wants to be stuck with something that they don't really know what to do with. All right.
Or isn't worth something to someone else? Yeah.
Yeah, it's always worth something, but can you convert it? The Chinese have fixed the value of the renminbi. It's also called the yuan. It's basically the same thing, to the dollar, and it was not allowed to float. The the currencies that are hard currencies, they float every day. You know, today you might get 154 yen to the dollar. Tomorrow you might get 140. But that's the way the world works. The Chinese have wanted to fix the price of their currency so that they could essentially make their goods that they make cheaper in selling them somewhere else. So they've sort of like fixed it to their benefit. Well, that's okay, but let's say you want to manufacture a cell phone in China, all right, and you manufacture it over there, and somehow they want to be paid in renminbi, all right? The government's going to tell you how much that renminbi is worth. Or if you have a factory in China and you're making the phones, you're going to say, okay, here, it's going to be this much money. In China, you don't have the right to take, it's about, let's say, 7.1 renminbi to the dollar, just to pick a number. You don't have the ability to even take money out of China without the permission of their central bank. You get a dollar in the US, you can take it to Germany, you can take it to Sri Lanka, you can take it anywhere in the world, in Japan. But in China, it's different. They have essentially a closed system for their currency. That's why the Chinese have some problems, because a lot of people are saying, I want to do business globally, all right, but I don't want the renminbi. And so their currency is again tied into the failing real estate market. So it's all one ball of wax. China will never be able to be the global economic power it wants unless it's willing to take a risk. And that is risk that if China's economy, you remember how badly it occurred in the year 2000 when they went through essentially negative growth for 2 quarters because of COVID. That would have really hurt the Chinese. I mean, their currency would have really essentially inflated and become less valuable. All right. Chinese don't want that because they want to say, I want to make the rules and I want to say how much these things are worth. But if that's the case, you're not really going to be good in a world economy that depends on currencies that are hard, in other words, exchangeable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And I'm curious, what is the push, but besides the risk of floating, the variability and potential inflation and opening up the Chinese yuan to international trade, what are some other political considerations that Xi Jinping might be making?
China wants their people to keep their money in China, right? So if you're a Chinese billionaire and you've got, I don't know how many $1 billion you have, they're not dollars. They're in renminbi. What do most people around the world do when they see other currencies or other opportunities? They take their money, in this case renminbi, that they can't really convert into anything. They're going to say, "Oh, I want to buy a U.S. dollar." Or I want to buy a condominium in Monaco, or whatever else it is. But when you're part of this free thing, the Chinese have really locked down their economy, and you need permission to take the money out. Who's going to invest? The Chinese government, Xi Jinping, has less power over their economy. So if you're going to play the game of floating currencies, you if you, Laura, had $1,000 to invest and they're in renminbis, but the interest rate in the United States today is 5%, and in China, I can tell you it's like less than 1%. Where are you going to deposit your money, Laura? Are you going to deposit it in China and the U.S.? I think you're going to deposit it in the U.S. or somewhere else. And so, money, I don't understand it completely, but it's sort of the world I work in, floats and it moves around. And the Chinese are essentially terrified because if their economy, as it did, crashes in 2000, what are the Chinese people going to do? They're going to get their money out of the country. That's a really big thing that I think a lot of people generally just don't think about, because in the U.S. we have that ability, right? If at the end of the month you have $1,000 less in savings, you can put it wherever you want. If you want to, you could invest in the Chinese stock market. Not that I'd recommend it, but you could. The Chinese don't have that ability.
Mhm. No, that makes sense. And I think when talking about the China dynamics on the world stage, it's easy to think about some of the bigger box titles like the potential warfare, the more the militaristic threats between China and the U.S. But it's important to take a step back and look at some of the internal effects, some of the internal characteristics that are going to be affecting China's ability to maintain and exercise power on the world stage. I did want to transition a little bit to talking about China and its relationship with Taiwan, as that's a very hot topic. It's something that we're constantly thinking about. And I want to start off with, why is China so obsessed with Taiwan? Why is it such a disputed boundary? And on the flip side, why is the U.S. so interested in Taiwan? Because the U.S. hasn't taken a very substantial stance on Taiwan either. We have the Congress, who has continuously expressed support for Taiwan, but the executive branch hasn't necessarily made those statements. So, what is it about Taiwan that is getting hooked in for both China and the US?
Let's go back to the 1930s. You had Mao Zedong and you had a guy named Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek was with a group called the Kuomintang. I'm not sure my Chinese is right, but that's close enough to what it is. The Kuomintang lost in 1949, and essentially Chiang Kai-shek took a bunch of his friends and a lot of ships with a lot of the artwork from China and moved it to Taiwan. And after that, in the 1950s, there was and this would be before your time, but they had islands called Quemoy and Matsu, which were two little islands which were right off the Chinese coast, but they were claimed by the Taiwanese. The U.S., until the time of Richard Nixon, basically said, China, hands off. And as I said a few minutes ago, China was very poor then, didn't have any money, and so I think they were frustrated by it. But they sort of did that. They sort of kept their hands off. Richard Nixon, to the surprise of everybody, I think it was 1972, said, I want to open up relationship with China, which everybody was surprised because he was an anti-communist Republican, but he made that step. So as a result of it, at that time, the U.S. government came up under Nixon saying we have a one China policy. In other words, Taiwan is sort of part of China, but the real story was is that the Congress never liked that. And so the Congress has always been much more protective of the sovereignty of Taiwan. Um, they call themselves the Republic of China. There is no embassy from the U.S. in Taiwan, Republic of China, but we do have essentially what is an embassy there, but they call it something else. All right. Xi Jinping seems to be obsessed with getting China's control over Taiwan back. The biggest year coming up is 2049. Why? That's 100 years from the time Chiang Kai-shek left and the Communist Party, the CCP, came into power. So if not before then, China by 2049 wants to enfold this. Now, do they really need Taiwan? The answer is no. Taiwan, and I've been there, is a long, skinny, rocky island. They have Kaohsiung in the bottom and they have Taipei at the top. They have 23, 22 million people. It's a very strong economy. They make the best chips in the world. But is it really important to China that they took over Taiwan? The answer is not really. It doesn't. China is, as we said, 1.4 billion people versus 23 million, this little rocky thing out there. But China is now trying to expand its military presence in the Pacific and having Taiwan there, to which the U.S. Congress sells military, products, planes, and everything else. So Xi Jinping really has said to us, please stay away. What's really been interesting is that there have been legislators from the Congress visiting Taiwan for a long time, really for decades. But Nancy Pelosi announced I think that's now about 18 months ago. I'd have to look, maybe it's 2 years ago. But she says, look, I'm going to go to Taiwan. Well, Xi Jinping said, you're not going to go to Taiwan. You can't go to Taiwan. Well, I don't know what your politics are, and I don't care, but I don't think anybody says to then Speaker of the House of Representatives Nancy, you can't do this, because needless to say, Nancy did go, and so that's one thing. The second thing is that this really has to do with the Law of the Sea Conference, but every country is supposed to have a certain amount of water around it, in which it becomes what's called their territorial waters. All right. Well, China's should only extend out so far. But what the Chinese have been doing militarily, and really particularly strongly under Xi Jinping, is increasing the size of their military, particularly their navy. It's called the PLAN, P-L-A-N, People's Liberation Army Navy. The PLAN is now pushing out into the Pacific, and sitting right there is Taiwan. And I think this is a matter of face for the Chinese. It's not an economic issue, but I think you remember when Russia, you probably don't remember, but in the 1960, when we had Castro and we had the Bay of Pigs, when it looks like the Russians were then going to put their missiles into Cuba, we went a little crazy and we had the Bay of Pigs, and eventually the Chinese withdrew. All right. I'm sorry. I'm confusing it. The Russians withdrew at that point. But Taiwan is not a military threat to China. So it's something that maybe not even the Chinese really understand, but it's certainly important, and it's increasingly important because the Chinese are making it more difficult for ships to get in and out of Taiwan. They haven't created a blockade, but it's more difficult. Their military is making overflights in the region, essentially saying, we're China and we want you to have it. That's the best explanation I give you of a very complex situation, and it's not getting any better.
Yeah, well, and it's difficult because we only have so much time, and your book is chock full of really interesting topics, and all of them are very complex, or they become very complex situations. So I appreciate your brevity on this particular subject, and I'm curious, what's the current impact of Russia's war on Ukraine affecting the way that Xi Jinping is looking at Taiwan and assessing what move to make in regard to Taiwan without completely starting something that's too big for them to chew.
It would be difficult for the People's Republic of China to invade Taiwan. You saw all the problems that Putin had when Moscow being 600 miles up the road, and he thought he was going to drive down and go into the Ukraine. We all know the end where that story is now. If you were going to invade Taiwan, and if you were China, you would have to have a land invasion that's based upon boats on the People's Liberation Army Navy. That would be very expensive. It would be very hard to do. And I don't know yet if the Chinese Navy is strong enough to do it, but clearly they could. And so, what price is Xi Jinping willing to pay if he could move into Taiwan tomorrow? Okay, let's say he moves into Taiwan tomorrow, which he could at great expense and cost. What happens? I think that the Chinese economy totally collapses because China is dependent upon manufacturing products and goods and services that it exports around the world. You have seen what happened in Russia. To go back to your question, what happened to Russia when NATO came about and the US was involved? All of these financial sanctions, military sanctions. The same thing would happen to China. So Xi Jinping would ruin his economy and maybe have, hopefully, not a military confrontation with the US, but there would be a lot of problems. So, in the short run, I don't see that China is willing to pay the price. But 2 or 3 years from now, and if we had a different president, if we had a president of the United States who was not essentially supporting Taiwan indirectly, America has what's called an ambiguous policy with China, basically saying, we won't tell you whether we'll defend Taiwan or not, but you better not do it. And we continue to sell, and the Congress approves this, military weapons systems to the Taiwanese. But again, you got 23 million people versus 1.4 billion. If the 1.4 billion really wanted to take over Taiwan, they could. But we'll have to see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and of course, some sort of invasion, or regardless of some sort of invasion, we're already seeing an impact on supply chain, which is another max trend that you identify in your book. And although this is not the only implication on the supply chain, the issue between China and Taiwan, there are other implications of supply chain effects that China is going to need to be thinking about in the next 30 to 50 years. And you make a very important distinction. We often think that supply chain issues came around more so through COVID, and that was COVID that shot our supply chains. But you identify a number of cracks that were present in supply chains across the globe before COVID, and particularly in China. What was some of the basis in the supply chain issues that COVID exacerbated?
Okay. I have a watch here. It's a mechanical watch. It has 120 pieces. It's a wonderful watch. If one thing in the watch breaks, it's a piece of junk. All right. The theory behind the supply chain is I'm going to tell you today what I want you to deliver to me 3 months from now. So I put an order into China. It goes to a factory. They make it. It has to go to Shanghai. It has to go through the port of Shanghai. It has to go to the West Coast or East Coast US. And so it's like a 60 to 90-day thing. All right. That's fine, but it's like my watch. Whenever you miss a piece, and that's what happened with COVID. The theory is I don't want to put, this is the financial people. In the old days, you used to have inventory. You'd have a factory here, and you'd have a bunch of parts over here, and if you were going to use them, you'd have a lot of money. But in the 1980s, they came up with the just-in-time manufacturing theory. That is, just make it and you're going to ship it. Well, that works, but it's like my watch. When that one part breaks, it doesn't going to do it. So if you make something in China, it's going to take you a minimum of 90 days to get it to the U.S. I'm talking about whether it's a piece of equipment or it's a part, you're going to do that. That has always been a risk, but we had a really good run. Okay, we had the Afghanistan war and we had other kind of problems, but nothing displaced this as much as COVID, because China essentially for 6 months didn't manufacture anything. And then when the Chinese started to improve, what happened? It moved to Asia, then it moved to Europe, then it came to the United States. And so one of the things I talk about to companies, because I work with companies, I was going to say, look where you get your things, your products, your parts. If you are sole sourcing that out of anywhere, China most particularly, that's not very smart. So again, going back to my watch here, if it has the part that goes inside that makes it, let's say the spring, I don't need one spring manufacturer in China, no matter what it costs. I need a second one somewhere else. And so the global supply chain is one thing. The second thing is the relationship between China and the United States is not very good today. I don't need to tell you that, or your listeners. You all know that. And is it getting any better? I think the answer is no. And so it COVID was the economy stopped because people got sick. But what if the Chinese people say, I'm not going to sell you springs for your watches anymore because I don't like you? What's going to happen? You're not going to be able to make any watches, or you're going to make a watch without a spring. And so that's really the global supply chain. It was lucky. It had a 30-year run, but just-in-time manufacturing, I think, is not very bright. That's why you've seen a lot of called, when we took jobs from the United States during the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, about 13 million jobs went out of the United States for other things. We are now thinking about reshoring them, bringing them back here to the U.S., or we have what's called the USMCA, U.S. Mexico Canadian Free Trade Agreement, used to be called NAFTA. So if you bring it into Mexico, you bring it into Canada and the U.S., isn't it better to have something in Guadalajara that you have rather than 13,000 miles away with somebody who's maybe not your friend? Life's complicated, and there's no easy answer to this, but the risks that companies take, and this is what I do as a lawyer, I'm going to say, think about your risk. Are you really willing to risk you're not being able to produce your products? And I think more and more companies are saying, I got to think about it.
Yep. Yeah, which is certainly an issue. There's a number of other max trends that you identify, and I'd like to start moving towards what the West can do in response to these ails that China will or is currently experiencing. But before we do that, what are some of the other most potent or most powerful max trends that you identified in your book that China is concerned about or needing to address in the near future?
Let me give you a couple. One of them is technological innovation. Okay. For the last 30 years, as China grew, they basically took Western technologies in their manufacturing and produced these products for the West and made trillions and trillions of dollars. China has been, I think, and Xi Jinping generally has been frustrated by the fact that there's not enough Chinese technology. One of the things I write about in the book is I think in the next 20 years that you're going to see a world which almost has two technologies, right? And when you have the two technologies, that's going to be a challenge for the world, because you're going to say Huawei is the major Chinese company that makes cell phones for them, all right, mobile phones. We have Apple and we have Google and other ones over here. They have different bases of technology. And so I think one of the things we're going to see is 20 years from now, maybe a country's going to have to decide whose technology, or which, whether it's Chinese or Western technology. Today, about 2/3 of the technology, this is my estimate, I can't prove it, is about Western technology. But a third of it's Chinese, but the Chinese are growing more and more. The Chinese, and Xi Jinping, I think, was smart to do this, in 2015, put a Made in China 2025 program in. Basically, what the program did, it has identified 25 technologies that the Chinese thought were really important and smart, and they started to develop their own technologies in those areas. One of them is obviously AI, and we could go through the list. A lot of it's in the medical fields, but the Chinese are not going to be happy with saying, okay, we'll take your Western technology, we'll make things, we're going to make money for you, because the real money is to be made not just in manufacturing, but in R&D, in developing your own technologies. And on this, the Chinese are really focusing on that, and that's a really important thing. One max trend that I think is really strange is called nationalism. We used to have um, in the 1930s, every country was unto itself. But thank God, after World War II, we made transnational trade more important. So countries did different things, and we cooperated. And if you look after World War II until now, the poverty in the world has been reduced by about 70%, basically because more countries were able to do more things. But what you see happening now is nationalism. Countries are looking more inwardly than outside. Take a look at Brexit. I don't have to tell you what Brexit has done for the UK. Whether you're British or not, you're probably not particularly pleased. The US, in its own way, is becoming more inward looking. And so this nationalism is again going to make it more difficult for the Chinese to supply products to everybody around the world, because they're going to say, will the Chinese really be there when I need them to produce this? The answer is maybe yes and maybe no. So those are two max trends that we've talked about Taiwan. Um, the other thing is, part of this is the Chinese are starting to reject foreign investment. You're going to say, this is crazy. They made all this money from having foreign investment come in. But now, if you're a company in China that's owned by somebody who's not Chinese from outside, they want to put people on your boards of directors. They want to know where your technologies are. They want you to reveal your technologies. And foreign companies are saying, whoa, this is not exactly what I was thinking of doing. So I don't know. So those are just a couple of, other max trends. And one final thing that I think is important. There are very serious water problems and toxic air problems in China. China today has a very serious water problem. It used to be there was plenty of water. There's not. And so a challenge that Xi Jinping has is that a lot of the Chinese people are not as well as they used to be. They're being affected by these things. In Beijing, there are a lot of foreign embassies that don't have younger people with children there because the air is so toxic. It's one thing to say, we have global warming and there are all kinds of problems. But if you have children who are breathing these kind of things, China produces twice as much in pollutants as the United States. I mean, we produce too many. I mean, I'm not saying we're at this, but the Chinese are twice as high. That's a problem, because it's one thing if you're 50 or 60 years old and the air is not very good, but if you have a grandchild, or if you have children younger, that's going to have an impact. And that's why I think China is going to have to take a more serious look at more global warming and pollution, because if they don't, it could result in political problems.
As far as the Western response to all of these different cracks and challenges forming internally and externally for China, and we just see that it's a very complicated scenario. It's not clear who's going to come out with the upper hand. What is it about specifically international organizations that you identify in your book that you believe would assist the West in overcoming some of these challenges and addressing this situation with the most amount of success?
I think it would be a big mistake for the United States not to embrace international organization, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's the World Bank, whether it's the World Trade Organization, because at the end of the day, the U.S., of the kind of society we are, we not only have to, support ourselves, but we have to provide technology to the world. China has gotten into certain organizations and exerted themselves. I mean, we're never really going to know what happened in China during the COVID crisis, because the World Health Organization, it has essentially not been very forthcoming for how that happened. And I'm not going to get into that issue. That's a problem for another time. But I believe that international organizations can lead to a better world in the long run, but we have to embrace what they are. The other thing is we haven't talked about it at all, but Africa is really important. All right.
Mm.
What what continent is going to be bigger than China in the next 20 years? The answer is Africa. Correct. And I don't think the U.S. has paid enough attention to Africa. And it is a treasure trove of minerals and things that the world needs. I think the U.S. has made a mistake in not making Africa a priority. I think we should have not necessarily more embassies there, but we have to pay closer attention to it. That's something the U.S. can do because China's they have what's called the Belt and Road Initiative, in which they have essentially spent trillions, not exaggerated, trillions of dollars to create relationships with countries. The U.S., I don't think, has been smart enough under Trump, under Biden, under Obama, and going back even further. I think Africa needs to have a greater attention to it. One other thing is, in life, you have to have priorities, okay? And our number one priority over the next 30 years has to be China. The Middle East is going to come and go. I don't think they're ever going to get along very well, but it's going to be there, right? But if we as a country, don't make China our priority, the Chinese are hardworking and they're smart. For example, although their economy is going down, they have 4 times as many workers as we have 330 million people in the U.S. They have 1.2 or 3 or 4 billion people. Do the math. So if we allow the Chinese to be aggressive and we ignore what they're doing, then I think we're going to pay the price. So the number one advice I give in my book is, U.S., wake up. The Chinese are smart. They're hardworking. And if you don't want them to overtake the U.S. over the next 20 or 30 years, you have to be more intelligent and you basically have to focus on them. Not necessarily as an enemy, but as somebody that you see they are the most serious challenge to America's role in the world today, both militarily and economically.
Again, I want to thank you so much for coming on today. This has been a really enjoyable conversation. And for our listeners, The Fragility of China by Dennis Unkovic is, of course, available wherever books are sold. And Dennis, thank you so much for coming on today.
Laura, thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes. I hope you found this conversation interesting and that it expanded your interest into Chinese and global politics. Of course, you know where to like and subscribe, send us a DM or a comment with your thoughts, and of course, send this to a friend or a foe. I'm Laura Laurent, and this has been Madison's Notes.